The Zendari transport vessel, logical progression, hummed with an eerie efficiency as Miguel made his way through the gleaming corridors. Unlike human spaceships from the movies with their blinking lights and dramatic control panels, everything here was smooth, minimalist, and unsettlingly quiet. His assigned quarters resembled a laboratory more than a bedroom. White surfaces, recessed lighting, and not a single decorative item to be found. Environmental adaptation space, the ship's liaison officer Venko had called it, though the terms room and officer seemed too emotional for the Zendari vocabulary. Everything was a function, a position, a utility. Miguel placed his small bag of permitted personal items on the sleeping platform. Earth's gravity still lingered in his muscles, making his movements seem clumsy compared to the gliding precision of the Zendari crew. He removed his most treasured possession, a hand-woven bracelet his grandmother had made him before she passed away last year. "Inefficient construction," remarked a voice from the doorway. Miguel turned to see a young Zendari, approximately his equivalent age, studying him with large, multifaceted eyes that reflected the room in dozens of tiny hexagons. "I'm Miguel," he offered with a smile. Designation Narlin, educational sector candidate, specialization in xenobiology. The young Zendari responded without returning the smile. Zendari facial structures weren't designed for human expressions, but Miguel had studied enough about their communication to recognize the subtle tilt of head that indicated curiosity. That artifact, it serves what function? Miguel looked down at the colorful bracelet. "My abuela, my grandmother, made it for me. It doesn't really have a function. It's just special to me because she made it." Narlin's inner eyelids flickered rapidly, the Zendari equivalent of processing confusion. The creator's identity alters the object's value despite no change in practical application. Fascinating inefficiency. Before Miguel could explain further, a soft tone echoed through the chamber and a portion of the wall illuminated with Zendari script alongside an English translation. Mandatory orientation begins in 3 minutes. Proceed to Knowledge Transfer Chamber 5. "You will follow," Narlin stated, already turning to leave. The Knowledge Transfer Chamber turned out to be a semicircular room where 7 other Zendari youth stood in perfect formation. Miguel awkwardly took a position at the end of their line, feeling the weight of their sidelong glances. A tall Zendari with elaborate markings etched into their exoskeleton activated a hovering display that filled the center of the room with a 3-dimensional model of their destination, the Zendari homeworld of Zendar Prime. "You now represent the first interspecies educational exchange program," the instructor began without introduction. "This initiative exists to evaluate human cognitive adaptability and to assess potential value integration for the collective progress." Miguel shifted uncomfortably. The way they discussed the program made it sound less like a cultural exchange and more like a laboratory experiment. Zendar Prime atmospheric conditions have been modified in the human sectors to allow survival without supplemental equipment, the instructor continued. However, acceptable margins of environmental discomfort will be maintained as biological stress promotes accelerated adaptation. In other words, Miguel translated mentally, they'd made it so he wouldn't die, but they were keeping it uncomfortable enough to toughen him up. Great. Observe primary protocol parameters, the instructor said as data scrolled beside the planetary model. First, efficiency is optimal morality. Second, contribution determines value. Third, collective advancement supersedes individual needs. The young Zendari around him bobbed their heads in practiced unison. Miguel attempted to mimic the gesture but received a disapproving click from Narlin. Integration predictions suggest a 73.8% probability that the human specimen will experience emotional distress within the first solar cycle, the instructor noted, speaking as if Miguel weren't present. Observation logs must be detailed. Miguel swallowed hard, suddenly realizing he wasn't just the first human child to visit Zendar Prime. He was their test subject, their curiosity, their living experiment in human inefficiency. As the orientation continued, Miguel's thoughts drifted to his family back on Earth. His mother had been so proud when he was selected, his father so confident that this would secure his future. Ambassador to the stars, they called him. But standing here among beings who viewed compassion as a defect and sentiment as a wasteful evolutionary byproduct, Miguel was beginning to understand just how vast the gulf between their species truly was. And in 3 days, they would reach Zendar Prime, where he would be completely surrounded by a civilization that calculated everything, including the value of life itself. The laughter of the Zendari students pierced through the marketplace's ambient hum like shards of glass. Miguel remained kneeling beside the elderly figure, his offered water flask still extended. He couldn't understand why helping someone was cause for such mockery. "You contaminate yourself for no resource gain," Corinna explained, her voice modulator barely containing what sounded like disgust. "This is why humans remain planetary-bound for so long. Irrational resource distribution." The beggar's eyes, deep amber with vertical pupils, gazed up at Miguel with an intensity that seemed to look through him rather than at him. Her trembling hand finally accepted the water flask, and as their fingers briefly touched, Miguel felt an unusual static sensation dance across his skin. "Thank you, Star Child," she whispered in perfect, unaccented English. Before Miguel could react to this surprise, Corinna grabbed his shoulder with 3 of her digits, the pressure firm enough to indicate immediate compliance was expected. "Educational Supervisor Valtor approaches," she hissed. "Social contamination is a Level 3 violation of exchange protocols." A tall Zendari with elaborate shell markings denoting senior educational status glided toward them, surrounded by a small cloud of hovering data spheres. The crowd of laughing students immediately arranged themselves into a perfect formation, their previous amusement hidden behind masks of efficient respect. "Exchange Specimen Miguel," Valtor addressed him, using the formal title that still made Miguel wince internally. "Explain this behavioral anomaly." Miguel stood, feeling every Zendari eye analyzing his response. The beggar had already slipped away into the crowd with surprising agility for someone who had appeared so frail moments before. "She needed help," Miguel said simply. Valtor's head tilted at exactly 23 degrees, the Zendari expression of processing illogical input. "Clarify the benefit calculation that led to your action." "There wasn't a calculation," Miguel tried to explain. "She was thirsty. I had water. Humans help each other." The educational supervisor's inner eyelids flickered rapidly. "Incorrect. Historical analysis confirms humans regularly ignore suffering of conspecifics. Your species allows resource inequality despite production capability. Your action represents statistical behavioral outlier, not species norm." Miguel opened his mouth to argue but realized he couldn't deny Earth's imperfections. Still, something in him couldn't let this go. "Maybe we're not perfect at it," he admitted, "but most humans believe helping others is right, even when we fail to do it." Fascinating cognitive dissonance, Valtor observed, the data spheres around him rapidly recording notes. Belief system disconnected from behavioral patterns. Highly inefficient. One of the Zendari students, Texley, stepped forward with precise movements. "Educational Supervisor, I have compiled visual documentation of the incident for collective analysis." She projected a holographic recording from her communication implant, showing Miguel's interaction with the beggar from multiple angles. "Acceptable initiative," Valtor acknowledged. "Upload to the Exchange Behavioral Database. Tag as Emotional Resource Misallocation. Subcategory, Non-Reciprocal Giving." The market continued bustling around them, other Zendari flowing past this scene without a second glance. Efficiency meant not stopping for non-essential observations. Only the educational group remained focused on Miguel, their analytical stares making him feel like a bacterium under a microscope. "The scheduled cultural immersion will continue," Valtor announced. "Tonight's comparative analysis session will use this incident as primary discussion focus." As the group reorganized to continue their market tour, Miguel noticed something strange. The security drones, normally positioned at fixed intervals throughout public spaces, had formed an unusual pattern overhead. Their sensory arrays all seemed to be oriented toward him, rather than maintaining their standard surveillance grid. Kurna noticed his upward gaze. "Your behavior disrupts operational norms," she explained, misinterpreting his observation. Security systems prioritize anomalies. But as they moved deeper into the marketplace, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't ordinary security measures. The drones moved with too much purpose, their tracking too precise. It reminded him of the presidential security detail he'd once seen during a school trip to Washington, D.C., not monitoring for threats, but providing protection. Why would helping a beggar trigger this kind of attention? The market's next section featured technological wonders that would have normally captivated him completely. Molecular food synthesizers creating impossible flavors, gravity-defying transportation pods, neural entertainment systems. But Miguel's thoughts remained fixed on the beggar woman's eyes and her perfect English, on the strange feeling that passed between them when their hands touched, on the security drones still subtly tracking his movement. Something important had just happened, though he couldn't possibly understand what. Not yet. Miguel sat alone in the Academy's nutrient consumption area, the Zendari equivalent of a cafeteria. Unlike the communal tables he was used to on Earth, each student occupied an individual pod designed to maximize efficient intake without the distraction of socialization. The isolation wasn't by choice. His usual proximity tolerance had been revoked after yesterday's market incident, relegating him to the far corner where his disruptive tendencies wouldn't contaminate others. His communication tablet pinged with yet another incoming message. With reluctance, he swiped it open to find a crude animation someone had created using footage from the market. In it, a caricature of Miguel threw resources into an incinerator while statistics about optimal allocation flashed across the screen. The creator had added a voiceover in the Zendari language that his translator rendered as humans, evolving backward one emotional decision at a time. The counter showed it had been viewed 12,467 times in the past hour. Their humor lacks nuance, king of quiet voice. Miguel looked up to see Sita 7 standing beside his isolation pod, her slender form casting a faint shadow across his table. Unlike other Zendari students with their chromatic shell modifications displaying family lineage, Sita 7's exoskeleton remained an unadorned light blue. The numerical suffix in her name marked her as lab-grown rather than family-raised, a fact that gave her lowest-tier social standing despite her impressive academic record. "You're not supposed to be talking to me," Miguel pointed out. "Proximity restrictions, remember." Sita 7's inner eyelids flickered in what Miguel had learned was the Zendari equivalent of a dismissive gesture. Proximity restrictions specify social contamination prevention. I am collecting xenobiological data. Different protocols. It was a technicality, but one that would work if anyone questioned her. Miguel appreciated the cleverness of it, and the fact that someone was actually willing to speak to him. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice modulator adjusted to a frequency below standard Zendari communication range. Miguel sighed. "I've explained this 26 times in my mandatory reflection sessions. She needed help. I helped. That's what humans do." "Incorrect," Sita 7 countered. "Humans demonstrate significant statistical variance in altruistic behavior." Many humans would have ignored her, as evidenced by socioeconomic disparity metrics on Earth. "Maybe," Miguel admitted, "but we at least believe helping is the right thing to do, even when we fail at it." Sita 7's head tilted slightly. The distinction between action and belief is inefficient. "Being human is inefficient," Miguel said with a small smile. "That's kind of our thing." His tablet pinged again, this time with a formal notification. His host family had scheduled an immediate intervention session to address his continued cultural resistance. The message included a list of talking points they would cover, including evolutionary disadvantages of emotional decision-making and strategies for suppressing inefficient cognitive patterns. Your host family is Sector 9 Administration, Sida 7 observed, reading the notification upside down with perfect ease. High status, low flexibility. They're trying to help, I think, Miguel said without conviction. In their way. Sida 7 was quiet for a moment, her compound eyes reflecting the cafeteria's clinical lighting in kaleidoscopic patterns. There is something you should know, she finally said, her voice dropping even lower. Before the efficiency reformation 3 centuries ago, there were different values. Miguel leaned closer, intrigued. What do you mean? Before she could answer, a sharp tone echoed through the room, the signal for end of consumption period. Students immediately rose in perfect synchronization, disposing of any remaining food and arranging themselves by class designation. Tonight, Sida 7 whispered as she turned to join her group. Accessed Historical Archive Terminal 7. Search Protocol Compassion Directive. Use access code V3 to 9 Zenith. She merged seamlessly into the stream of departing students, leaving Miguel with more questions than answers. As he gathered his things, he noticed something strange. The security drones that had been monitoring him since the market incident had momentarily shifted their focus to Sida 7. Whatever she was planning to show him, it clearly wasn't standard academic material. Miguel's host parent Pelrin was waiting outside the consumption area, her expression unreadable as always behind the Zendari's rigid facial structure. Additional remedial integration has been scheduled, she stated without greeting. The collective has expressed concern about your developmental trajectory. Great, Miguel muttered. More lessons on why caring is wrong. Pelrin's inner eyelids flickered rapidly. Incorrect characterization. Efficiency is optimal morality. Your recalibration is for your benefit. As they walked toward the intervention chamber, Miguel's thoughts remained fixed on Sida 7's words. A historical archive, the Compassion Directive. And beneath his confusion, a growing realization, there was more to Zendara society than they wanted him to know. The royal guards escorted Miguel through a crystalline corridor that seemed to shift and breathe with living light. Unlike the sterile, functional architecture of the academy and public spaces, these passages contained flowing forms and subtle patterns that reminded Miguel of coral reefs and rainforests on Earth, organic, purposeful complexity rather than utilitarian simplicity. This doesn't look like Zendari design, Miguel observed, breaking the heavy silence. The guard commander's multifaceted eyes regarded him briefly. This is true Zendari design, she stated. What you have seen elsewhere is merely contemporary application. Before Miguel could ask what that meant, they arrived at an ornate entryway composed of interlocking geometric shapes that continuously reconfigured themselves. The guards arranged themselves in a precise formation, their exoskeletons shifting hue to match the entryway's dominant colors, a ceremonial display Miguel had never witnessed before. You will enter alone, the commander instructed. Speak only when addressed. Maintain eye contact, but limit observation of peripheral chamber details. This is considered respectful. Miguel swallowed hard. What if I make a mistake? I haven't been trained for royal protocol. Something almost like amusement flickered across the commander's features. Your lack of training is precisely why you are here, human child. The entryway spiraled open, revealing a vast chamber that defied the physical dimensions Miguel had observed from outside. Somehow, the room seemed larger inside than the building that contained it. The floor was a reflective surface that resembled water but felt solid beneath his feet. The ceiling appeared to open directly into space, showing stars and nebula that couldn't possibly be visible from inside a planetary atmosphere. And there, seated on a throne that seemed to grow from the floor itself, was the beggar woman, transformed. Gone were the tattered robes and hunched posture. Instead, she sat with regal stillness, her form draped in material that shifted between states of matter, sometimes appearing solid, sometimes liquid, sometimes like captured light. The crown upon her head contained what looked like miniature galaxies swirling within its crystalline structure. Medial rays of Earth, she spoke, her voice carrying the same melodic quality he remembered from the marketplace, but now infused with unmistakable authority. Approach the circle of truth. Miguel noticed a subtle pattern on the floor before the throne, concentric rings etched with symbols he couldn't read. He stepped forward carefully until he stood within these circles, feeling a strained vibration through the soles of his shoes. "Do you know who I am?" the Empress asked. "You're the woman from the market," Miguel answered honestly. "But you're also the Empress." "I am Empress Zolthara, seventh of my name, unifier of the seven systems, bearer of the eternal flame," she confirmed. "What you witnessed in the marketplace was the 300th cycle of the perspective walk." Miguel's mind raced to understand. "You were disguised as a beggar on purpose." "How else would I know the true heart of my empire?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. Her eyes, those same penetrating amber eyes, studied him with fierce intelligence. "For 3 centuries, not a single Zendari has acknowledged my existence during these walks. Not one has offered assistance, companionship, or even recognition. Then you arrived." She gestured, and the air beside her throne shimmered to reveal floating images of Miguel, kneeling beside her disguised form, offering his water flask. The footage played from multiple angles. The security drones, he realized. "Would you explain why you helped me?" the Empress asked. Miguel hesitated, aware that his answer somehow mattered more than any test he'd taken at the academy. "Because you're a person," he finally said. "That's enough of a reason." The Empress's expression remained unreadable, but something in the quality of light around her seemed to soften. "A person," she repeated thoughtfully. "Not a productive unit. Not a resource allocation node. A person." She rose from her throne in one fluid motion, descending steps that materialized beneath her feet as needed. The guards at the entryway dropped to one knee, their headplates lowered in deference. "Miguel Rays of Earth," the Empress said as she approached him, now close enough that he could see flecks of gold within her amber eyes. "You have reminded an ancient empire of something it chose to forget. For that, I owe you a truth." She extended her hand, palm upward, revealing an intricate tattoo that seemed to move across her skin like living calligraphy. "Would you like to know what we were before efficiency became our god?" Miguel hesitated only briefly before placing his hand beneath the Empress's outstretched palm, careful not to touch the moving tattoo. The moment he did, the chamber around them dissolved into a kaleidoscope of light and memory. They stood now in what appeared to be an ancient Zendari city, not the sterile, geometric metropolis Miguel had seen from the transport ship, but a vibrant, organic sprawl of structures that mimicked natural formations. Crystalline spires twisted like growing plants, buildings nestled within each other like shells, and everywhere, Zendari moved with fluid grace rather than measured precision. "This is Zendar Prime 1,000 years ago," the Empress explained, her voice echoing strangely in this memory space. Before the Great Optimization, Miguel watched in amazement as Zendari of various ages gathered in public squares. Unlike the rigid silence of modern interactions, these ancestors laughed, argued, and expressed a full range of emotions. Their exoskeletons displayed vivid, changing colors that seemed to reflect their feelings. "Your species has a misconception about mine," the Empress continued. "You believe we evolved as logical beings who prioritized efficiency. The truth is more complex." The scene shifted to show Zendari caring for their elderly, their movements gentle and unhurried despite the obvious resource consumption such care required. In another area, artists created sculptures with no apparent function beyond beauty. "We were once among the most empathic species in the known galaxy," she said, a note of sorrow entering her voice. "Our capacity for emotional resonance allowed us to build a civilization based on mutual care and creative expression. Our technology advanced because we sought to reduce suffering and increase joy for all." The scene darkened, shifting to show a devastating stellar event, a nearby star going supernova, bathing Zendar Prime in radiation that would have destroyed less advanced civilizations. "The crisis of light changed everything," the Empress explained. We survived only through rapid adaptation of our technology and social structures. Emergency protocols prioritized maximum efficiency of resource allocation. What began as necessary measures for survival calcified into dogma. Miguel watched as generation after generation of Zendari grew increasingly regimented, their colorful exoskeletons fading to uniform shades, their movements becoming more measured, their interactions more sparse. Over centuries, our educational systems were redesigned to suppress emotional development in favor of logical processing. The capacity for empathy was bred out of most bloodlines, considered an evolutionary disadvantage that encouraged inefficient resource allocation. But not from the royal line, Miguel observed, understanding dawning. You still feel things the way your ancestors did. The Empress nodded, the memory space shifting back to the throne room. The monarch must remember what others forget. This is our burden and our strength. She withdrew her hand, and Miguel felt a momentary dizziness as the memory vision faded. They stood once again in the circle of truth, but the chamber seemed different now, sadder, like a beautiful mausoleum, rather than a seat of power. For 3 centuries, I have walked among my people disguised as their most vulnerable, hoping to spark even a flicker of the old compassion. The Empress said quietly. None recognized me, not as Empress nor as simply a being worthy of acknowledgement. Until you. Miguel processed this revelation, understanding the weight it carried. So when the Zendari mock humans for being inefficient and emotional, they mock what they once were, the Empress finished. What they were meant to be. She returned to her throne with fluid grace, the living crown on her head pulsing with gentle light. The protocol for making first contact with new species requires careful study before approval. When Earth was discovered, many argued your kind was too volatile, too emotional for safe integration. What changed their minds? Miguel asked. I did, the Empress stated simply. I saw in humanity a mirror of our past, flawed, inefficient, often irrational, but capable of profound compassion without calculation. I had hoped exposure to human culture might awaken something dormant in my people. She gestured to the hovering images of Miguel, helping her disguised form. You were not selected randomly for the exchange program, Miguel raised. Your psychological profile showed exceptional empathic capacity even by human standards. Miguel felt a chill run through him. You've been watching me specifically, since before I came here. The experiment required the optimal specimen, the Empress said, using the clinical language of her people, though her tone carried something warmer. But I did not anticipate just how powerfully your simple act of kindness would resonate. It has created possibilities. What kind of possibilities? The Empress's inner eyelids flickered, not with confusion, Miguel realized, but with something like hope. The possibility of remembering who we once were. The aftermath of the Empress's broadcast created ripples of confusion throughout Zendar Prime. Miguel watched from a private viewing chamber as public spaces filled with Zendari standing in uncharacteristic disarray, their normally precise movements now hesitant and uncertain. For a society built on unwavering certainty, the Empress's declaration had introduced something far more destabilizing than mere political change. She had introduced doubt. They don't know how to process it, observed Talus 9, one of the Empress's advisors who had been assigned to guide Miguel. Unlike the rigid educational supervisors at the academy, Talus 9 moved with a subtle fluidity that reminded Miguel of the ancient Zendari he'd seen in the Empress's memory vision. Will they be okay? Miguel asked, watching a group of Zendari attempting to distribute nutrition packets to elderly members of their community, their movements mechanical and awkward, as if following instructions in a language they barely understood. Define okay. Talus 9 replied, but without the dismissive tone Miguel had grown accustomed to from other Zendari. They are experiencing cognitive recalibration on a fundamental level. The Empress has challenged 3 centuries of evolutionary programming. On the viewing screen, a notification appeared. Miguel's first official appointment as junior cultural ambassador would begin in 30 minutes. The academy that had once mocked him was now required to host a symposium where he would explain basic concepts of human empathy to a panel of Zendari educators. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for this," Miguel admitted. "I'm just a kid." Talis Nine's inner eyelids flickered not with confusion, but with what Miguel was beginning to recognize as amusement. "You are precisely qualified because you are just a kid. The Empress believes the young may adapt more readily than the fully formed." Miguel's personal communication device chimed with incoming messages, hundreds of them from Zendari citizens requesting clarification on human concepts. What is the optimal duration of grief? Calculate the resource justification for assisting non-contributors. Provide efficiency metrics for family unit maintenance beyond reproductive utility. They're trying to quantify emotions, Miguel realized. They're looking for a formula. It is the only framework they understand, Talis 9 explained. They seek to optimize this new directive as they would any other. The door to the viewing chamber opened to reveal Karina, Miguel's former tormentor from the academy. Her usual confident posture was noticeably absent as she performed the formal greeting gesture with mechanical precision. "Junior Ambassador Miguel," she began, her voice modulator set to a respectful tone that sounded strange coming from her. "The Academy Collective requests your input on curriculum revisions." Miguel stared at her, remembering how gleefully she had recorded his humiliation in the marketplace. "You want my help? After everything?" Kurna's exoskeleton shifted hues slightly, a subtle expression of discomfort that most Zendari had evolved to suppress. "The Empress has declared your behavioral patterns optimal. The collective adapts accordingly." "That's not how this works," Miguel said, frustration building. "You can't just flip a switch and suddenly care about people. It's not about following a new set of rules." "Then explain the correct procedure," Kurna demanded, her tone revealing genuine confusion beneath the formal request. Miguel looked at Talis 9, who gave him the subtle head tilt that indicated he should proceed. Taking a deep breath, Miguel gestured for Karina to sit, an invitation that visibly surprised her. "There is no procedure," Miguel began gently. "Caring about others starts with seeing them as people with their own experiences, not as resources or units or statistics." "Inefficient," Kurna stated automatically, then paused as if catching herself. "But perhaps necessary." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Before Miguel could respond, the viewing screen flickered with a priority alert. Public demonstrations had broken out in 3 major Zendari cities. The camera showed something unprecedented. Zendari citizens had spontaneously gathered in open squares, their formations irregular and their voices raised in what appeared to be debate. "Behavioral containment protocols have been initiated," an automated voice announced. "No," Miguel said, alarmed. "They're just talking to each other. That's what people do when they're processing change." Talis 9 moved swiftly to a communication panel. "This is Royal Advisor Talis 9. Countermand containment protocols by order of the Empress. Designate public gatherings as cultural transition assemblies. Monitor, but do not interfere." As the security forces on screen stood down, Miguel realized the enormity of what was happening. An entire civilization was remembering how to have a conversation. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Miguel staring at a blank screen in his private quarters. The anonymous message had contained footage of Earth's most violent historical moments: wars, genocides, environmental disasters, all compiled to create a devastating portrait of humanity's darkest impulses. The sender, identifying only as Evolutionary Truth Coalition, concluded with a simple statement: "This is the emotional species the Empress would have us emulate." Miguel's hand trembled slightly as he closed the file. This wasn't the first such message he received in the 3 weeks since the Empress's announcement, but it was certainly the most comprehensive. The resistance movement was growing more sophisticated in their attempts to undermine the cultural reforms. A soft tone indicated someone at his door. Miguel composed himself before answering, surprised to find Karina waiting outside. Their relationship had evolved from tormentor and victim to something more complex. not quite friendship, but a cautious working alliance. The Connection Project presentation has been moved forward, she announced without greeting. The Guild representatives have requested additional verification protocols. Miguel nodded, understanding the subtext. The Guild of Evolutionary Perfection, the most powerful conservative faction opposing the reforms, wasn't simply requesting more information. They were creating obstacles. "Let me guess," Miguel said as they walked toward the presentation chamber. "They want evidence that intergenerational mentoring won't contaminate optimal development patterns." Ferna's exoskeleton shifted hues slightly, what Miguel now recognized as her version of a wry smile. "Your predictive modeling is improving," she noted. "They have submitted 27 distinct objections since yesterday." The corridor they traversed was different from the ones Miguel had first encountered upon arriving at Zendar Prime. Small aesthetic touches had begun appearing throughout the city: colored lighting panels, organic-shaped seating areas, even rudimentary art installations created by younger Zendari experimenting with non-functional design. "Have you seen this morning's metric report?" Kurta asked, her voice modulator adjusted to prevent eavesdropping. "Productivity has decreased 3.7% across all sectors." Miguel frowned. "The Guild will use that against us." "Yes, but satisfaction indicators have increased 12.4%, she added, her tone carrying a hint of wonder. "Individuals report experiencing contentment." Before Miguel could respond, they turned a corner and nearly collided with a group of Zendari wearing distinctive red shell modifications, members of the Guild's youth division. Their leader, a tall female named Vexton, stepped forward deliberately. "The human specimen appears operational," she said loudly, using the outdated designation that had been officially replaced. "Though one wonders how long its cognitive patterns will remain stable given the documentation of human psychological fragility." Miguel recognized the tactic. These public confrontations were designed to provoke emotional responses that could be recorded and distributed as evidence of human instability. "Council Member Vexten," he responded calmly, using her proper title. "The Connection Project presentation includes substantial data addressing psychological resilience across species. Your insights would be valuable during the discussion period." Vexton's inner eyelids flickered rapidly. She hadn't expected such a measured response. Next to Miguel, Corona subtly shifted her stance to a more formal posture, the hierarchical significance not lost on the Guild members. "The Guild has submitted its analysis already," Vexton replied. "We find the entire premise fundamentally flawed. Emotion is evolutionary regression." An unexpected voice joined the conversation, a fascinating hypothesis. "Perhaps you could explain, then, why our species achieved its greatest technological advancements during our pre-optimization era." Zeta 7 approached from an adjacent corridor carrying an antiquated data crystal that glowed with stored information. The Guild members shifted uncomfortably. Zeta 7's position as the Empress's newly appointed historical truth custodian gave her unprecedented access to sealed archives. "Correlation is not causation," Vexton countered, though with less certainty. "Indeed," Zeta 7 agreed pleasantly. "Which is why I've compiled innovation metrics across our civilization's timeline. Would you care to review the pattern analysis?" The Guild members retreated with formal excuses about scheduling conflicts. As they departed, Miguel noticed a subtle signal pass between Vexton and someone partially hidden in an alcove further down the corridor. A security officer whose drone controls could easily access Miguel's personal communications. The source of the anonymous transmission was suddenly clear. "They're getting desperate," Zeta 7 observed quietly. "The younger generations are adapting too quickly to the cultural reforms. The Guild fears losing control." Miguel nodded, watching the retreating Guild members. "That's what happens when you try to suppress something natural," he said. "It finds a way to express itself anyway." "Like water through crystal," Corinna added, using an ancient Zendari metaphor she couldn't possibly have learned at the academy. The resistance was growing more determined, but so was the remembering. The departure terminal hummed with an energy unlike anything Miguel had experienced during his arrival 11 months earlier. Where once Zendari moved with mechanical precision, carefully avoiding physical proximity, now small clusters gathered in conversation. Children, previously kept separate from adults except during designated educational periods, darted between groups, their exoskeletons displaying vibrant colors that would have been considered disruptively non-standard before the reforms. "They're actually laughing," Miguel observed to C-7, who stood beside him at the viewport overlooking the boarding area. "I didn't think Zendari physiology even allowed for laughter. Our vocal modulators were always capable of producing such sounds," C-7 explained. The expression was simply deemed inefficient and removed from developmental training. She demonstrated with a brief, melodic sound that approximated human laughter, still somewhat mechanical but unmistakably joyful. Miguel's transport vessel would depart in 30 minutes, returning him to an Earth that had been following the Zendari cultural transformation with intense interest. News feeds reported daily on what human sociologists were already calling the compassion revolution, with experts debating whether humanity had truly influenced Zendari development or merely reminded them of their own buried nature. A familiar figure approached, Kurina, now bearing the shell markings of the newly formed Cultural Preservation Council. The irony wasn't lost on Miguel. His former tormentor had become one of the most passionate advocates for preserving the rediscovered emotional heritage of her people. "The Empress requests your presence before departure," she announced, her formal tone belied by the subtle color shifts in her exoskeleton that Miguel had learned to read as excitement. "Another ceremony?" Miguel asked, having already endured 3 formal farewell events. "Not exactly," Kurina replied cryptically. They navigated through the terminal to a private chamber where, to Miguel's surprise, the Empress awaited not with her usual entourage, but alone, an unprecedented breach of security protocols. Even more shocking was her appearance. Gone were the formal regalia and living crown. Instead, she wore simple attire reminiscent of everyday Zendari, though elegantly designed. "Miguel Reyes of Earth," she greeted him, using his full designation as their customs required for significant moments. "I wish to speak with you one final time, not as Empress to Ambassador, but as one person to another." The deliberate use of the word person wasn't lost on Miguel. It echoed his answer in the throne room nearly a year ago when asked why he had helped a beggar. "I am honored," he replied, using the formal Zendari gesture that had once felt so alien, but now came naturally. "When you arrived, our civilization was dying," the Empress said directly. "Not physically, our technology would have sustained our biological existence for millennia. But spiritually, we were fossilizing into something that merely resembled life." She moved to the viewport, gazing out at the gathering of Zendari below. "There will be difficulties ahead. The Guild and other resistance factions will continue their efforts. Some older generations may never adapt, but the trajectory is set." From a concealed pocket, she produced a small crystalline object about the size of a marble. It pulsed with inner light that seemed to respond to her touch. "This is the first empathy stone created in 3 centuries, she explained, offering it to Miguel. Traditionally, they were given to connect family members across great distances. They respond to emotional states, allowing a form of connection beyond mere communication. Miguel accepted it carefully, feeling a warm vibration against his palm. The crystal briefly glowed with colors matching the friendship bracelet his grandmother had made him, the one Narlin had once dismissed as inefficient construction. "Its paired counterpart remains with me," the Empress continued. "It will serve as a reminder of what your simple act of kindness awakened in an entire civilization." Miguel felt the weight of his experiences on Zendar Prime, the mockery, the struggles, the breakthroughs, and finally the changes that had begun spreading through Zendar society like ripples in water. "I just did what anyone would do," he said softly. "No," the Empress corrected gently. "You did what everyone should do. There is a profound difference, one that my people are finally beginning to understand again." The departure announcement echoed through the terminal as Miguel carefully tucked the empathy stone into his pocket. As he turned to leave, the Empress did something unprecedented in recorded Zendari history. She extended her hand in a human gesture of farewell. "Until we meet again, Miguel Reyes," she said, person to person.